Puffer has talked about. And then I'm going to show lots of different examples. And at the end, I think I will have some time for questions if you have any. So thank you very much. Okay, so this all starts with this idea from the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, well known as the METI. And they put out this document back in 2010 talking about this global human resources and how students, once they graduated, weren't going to overseas anymore to engage in business, and Japan was starting to suffer. And so they put forth this document saying that we need students who can communicate, we need students who have these workplace abilities, and we have these students who need, students who have cultural understanding. Now, if I look at these as a teacher who teaches, for example, in a Kaiwa setting or in a Juku or in some sort of cram school, English conversation school setting, I might think, well, communication, I could do pair work. Or if I'm doing workplace abilities, I can do things like putting students in groups and having them work on some sort of mini exercise. Or I can have cultural understanding. I can open up a textbook that has, you know, things about festivals in different parts of the world, or foods that we eat in different parts of the world, and so forth and so on. So I didn't want to do that though, okay? Because, you know, in the CLIL environment, what I want to do is actually bring these together. And how do we do this? Well, when we think about the idea of communicating in a foreign language, we think about planning, working in teams, taking initiative, and we also think about this understanding different cultures. We can think about this in terms of the 4 C's, for example, where we have looking at different cultures. We can actually communicate while we're in teams, and we can actually use the language that we know or learn new language as we're going through the process of preparing something or taking initiative to do some sort of project or whatnot. Okay, so if I'm starting to conceptualize this kind of syllabus now, what I'm thinking of is, why is this not changing? Oh, there we go. Okay. Is giving the students some sort of prompt for some sort of environment or some assignment, for example. And I'm not really worried about the finished product. I'm going to put that aside for a few minutes and think about only the part between when I get the students this kind of prompt or this prepared bits of pieces of knowledge to before they finish the final product, the area that I want to observe. So I really want to observe this area. And Leontiev and this guy named deBoer last year to publish this article about this exact thing of, you know, if we're looking at the final product that the students have created, and we can assess that, but if we look at actually what happens in between and what the learners are actually doing in between, we get a huge different picture, a much more rich picture of what the students are actually doing to develop the language and content and understanding of these different concepts that we're giving them, or they're actually developing or discovering on their own. So how do we make this visible though? We want to open up the process. So we want to be able to make this visible. How do we do this? Well, Bernstein has talked about this in terms of how we conceptualize this idea of what content and language and how we go through this process, or how we actually develop the classroom or create a syllabus or some sort of assignment. And classification is the idea of being a math classroom, or being a geography classroom, or being a history classroom. So we have these different classifications, and a strong classification would be, you know, that these specific subjects or genres are very, very clear. You're walking into a math classroom. This is math class. Now, framing, on the other hand, is the idea of how this kind of curriculum will unfold. In other words, you know, page 1, we're going to cover, origin of life. And in chapter 2, we're going to cover the cell structure, cell division, reproduction. So we go through each individual chapter, and everything is perhaps assessed at the end of each chapter or whatnot. Now, if we're looking at this from the point of view of a classroom, which I want to look at more of the process and understanding what the students are doing, what I want to do is look at this from the point of view of, I don't know why this is not changing. There we go. I'm more of an invisible pedagogy. Well, now, what does this mean, invisible pedagogy? Well, I want to give the students some choice, some creativity and contingency. I want it to be competency-based. It means really there's no pre-specification of what is meant to be learned, or that there's no way that there's any sort of way that the curriculum is going to unfold. Okay, so we have weak classification. In other words, what are we going to learn? What are we going to discover we don't know? And weak framing, which means, if the students are having difficulty in discovering something or doing something, then we can take the time to develop that. Okay, but the idea is that there's no real endpoint. Now, in contrast, if I have this performance-based pedagogical approach, then I would have some sort of pre-specified or pre-programmed kind of curriculum and assessed based on some sort of inventory or standard. Okay, so what I'm doing here, though, is I'm looking at competency-based, and there's nothing that's pre-planned or pre-specified. Now, what happens in this kind of a classroom? Well, we can think of this term called, and again, I don't know why this is not changing. There we go. Centrifugal kind of interaction. Now, what does this mean? Centrifugal interaction. What this means is that we have this language competence it's multifaceted. It's drawing attention to distinguish between the face-to-face language of communication and academic language. In other words, there's an emphasis now on individual choice and individual agency. So in other words, whatever language that I think I need to use to be able to talk about some sort of concept, I can use the language that I have to do this. Now, in a classroom, you might find that the teacher is actually speaking academic language and the students are speaking the everyday language, but they're actually speaking the same language. So you can say the teacher is talking about having this, talking about circle in geometry class, circle, but the students are saying rounding because that's the language that they know. Okay. And then there's more emphasis in this kind of interaction where you have rich context of cognitively engaging content learning. In other words, it's competence-based. In other words, no matter how I have whatever language I use, I'm able to talk about whatever concept or whatever subject I'm talking about and being able to express that without having to worry about making a mistake or not using the correct language to do so. Okay. Now, on the other hand, we have the opposite, which is this idea of centripetal language or centripetal kind of approach or force. This is not changing. There we go. Okay. And this is getting into this centralization and unification. So what this means is that, if I'm talking about something in history class, for example, then we want the students to learn the language that specifically talks about this event, but in this particular way, because we don't want the language that they have to be used and possibly change the meaning. So in other words, the teacher has this kind of, this is what we want you to talk about. You're bringing the language to this central place where you're saying, here's what the language is that we want you to learn, and this is how you're going to be able to talk about it from the beginning. So there's less kind of agency for the student and more focus on how to say something in a particular way. So there's this force there. Now you see, if you look at both of these now, you can kind of see that there is this tension between the teacher saying, I want you to learn, or I want you to speak more academic language, but I'm still going to ground you in this sort of bringing you towards this sort of this academic language, but still being able to allow you to use the language that you have in the meantime until you can kind of learn to use both interchangeably. The language, that everyday language, never really disappears, as we know. So we want the students to be able to understand what this word means and what their language is and kind of bring those together. So we have this tension. Okay, this is what I want to focus on today. What do I mean by this? Well, if I'm developing this syllabus or this kind of activity or this sort of assignment now, what I want to do is I want to give the students as much agency as possible. In other words, I want them to use the language that they have, and I want them to interact as much as possible. And I want them to use whatever language they have available, BICS or CALP or a combination of the two. But at the same time, I want to put in this centripetal force. In other words, I want to put in this core concept that I want them to work from. And so I give them these parameters and I say, here's the core concept that I want you to work from. This is what you need to focus on, this concept. And I want you to develop some sort of poster or whatnot in the assignment. And then we can see, based on this concept now, where the interaction begins to emerge. So here's some examples of some things that I have done in the past, where we get the students to look at things like consumption, recycling, embodied energy, carbon footprint. And these kinds of assignments now have a specific content, a specific concept. And this concept is based on some sort of topic. For example, PET bottles on campus, or Big Mac attack, or carbon footprint, or chopsticks, or idling stop, or gasoline consumption. All these different kinds of topics with some sort of concept attached to those concepts, or to that topic. And my goal now is to have them research this and present about it. Okay, so this is basically what I want them to do. So we have this concept, which is my centripetal kind of force. And we have this topic now that they can do anything with, which we can see what happens as this centrifugal kind of interaction starts to emerge. So we're going to see them always sticking to this idea of recycling or embodied energy, but at the same time developing that and developing it further, using the language that they have and language that they encounter. Okay. So this is what a typical classroom might look like in my class. In other words, the students are never sitting down. They're always standing up. They're always moving around, because they're not just working on this project that I've shown you here, but they're working on all kinds of other stuff at the same time. Now, this context I'm looking at now is a first-year university students, their first semester. They've never met each other before. It's a general English course. Most of the students are science students, or agricultural students, or they're engineering students who are renowned for hating English. And there's 36 students in this class. And this is an advanced class. And these students are A2 level. So this is advanced. Keep that in mind. All right. So let's keep going. All right. Okay. So this language of learning now, I mean, in many cases, if you read any of the literature in CLIL, you'll see that there's, we must provide some sort of language, the language of the genre, for example. But I mean, if I'm giving them this project and this assignment with this idea of recycling as the concept, then what I want to do is I want to give them as much agency as possible, put the onus on them and have them do it. If I start to give them language, then it will kind of lead them in a direction that maybe they don't want to go, or maybe it's kind of saying to them, I want you to go in this direction. And I don't want to do that. So I'm kind of stepping back now. But again, these students, I mean, they've had 6 years of English. They've had junior high school 3 years. They've had high school 3 years. I mean, they're A2 level, but they have some English. Okay. Now, I want them to, going back to the many concepts, these many mandates, I want them to initiate, I want them to plan, I want them to have teamwork, and to create this intersubjectivity, or this understanding of what this idea of recycling is when it comes to these PET bottles on campus. So this is where everything starts to stem from. So I'm not really giving them any language to start off with. I'm kind of hoping that they're going to have some language that they've been learning in the past. Now, this course, it was face-to-face, of course, but what they do, though, is they start to share things online. And there's lots of things that you can use to share things online, but I use Moodle. Okay, and in the course, I had a forum that said, okay, in this project, you have your own, this group, you have your own private forum, and you can share as much information as possible. You can share ideas, you can share files, you can share concepts, you can share URLs, you can share video, whatever you want to share. And what I started to notice, though, is that in the forum area, there was two things that really began to emerge. Okay, so they're starting to go through this project. Okay, they're looking at this idea of, in this case here, Big Macs, embodied energy, and they're starting now to go through and really start to make their poster. Okay, now the poster itself is due at the week 8 of the course, and at the end of the course they have the PowerPoint presentation. But for the first 8 weeks, they're going to be looking at this project specifically, making a poster for this concept. So you'll see in the actual forum area there, they've got this dialogue. I made embodied energy roughly, and let's make it better. And they've got this uploaded poster, which is got additional information. Okay, so we've got here on the left-hand side, it looks like language of learning, but on the right-hand side, we've got the kind of integrated content and language with the concept's still there, the one that I gave them at the very beginning. Okay. Now the language for learning begins to emerge very, very clearly as I'm going through this now, because I can see things like changed, I added, I modified, I collected, I decided. So all this language is used in the forum itself as a message to tell each other what they're actually doing as they upload it. Okay, so this is really key, because what we begin to see, though, is this idea of this poster being shared, this improvable object, which is a concept, okay, that I want to really focus on, because I think it's really key for understanding how this process begins to emerge and how we can make this learning more visible. Okay, so what is this improvable object? Well, Wells talks about this. This is Wells stuff, a representation of the creator's current understanding. So this object can be anything. It could be a model, it can be a drawing, a story, poem, some sort of explanation, map, I mean, anything really, okay? But it's effective because what it does is it shows you at that particular point in time, this is my current understanding of what this object is or what should look like. And when I look at this object now, right, I can recognize that there's things I want to change, and it will motivate me to have some sort of revision. And then in that revision, it will lead to some sort of greater understanding. Okay. So improving the object is the goal of this joint activity between the learners as they're going through this, because this is a group of 4 students now, all right, in this project. And the it's recognizing how they are now beginning to understand how to actually create this poster or actually develop this poster even further, or actually this assignment they handed in. Now, this is one way to kind of look at or understand how this improvable object works. Now, I know we might have all seen this movie Ghost, right? And in the movie, you see Demi Moore sitting down and she's using her hands to mold this piece of clay. Now, if you think about the improvable object being this piece of clay, I mean, as you move your hands onto it, the shape of it changes. And now you can change the shape with your hands, but at the same time as the shape changes, this piece of clay tells you how it's changed and you react to that. So if I were to make a change with my hands to this piece of clay and I kind of move my hands away from it, I can see, what is this vase telling me, or what is this bowl telling me in terms of what I've done to it, okay? And if I've made it too tall or too short, I can kind of go back with my hands and change it again. So in other words, it's not just me changing this piece of clay, but the piece of clay is talking to me and telling me what I did to it. And therefore, I'm working with this piece of clay. I'm interacting with it in terms of how it responds to my touch, or how I've shaped my hands, and versus how I actually shape my hands to make a change further. And you can also bring in a number of different people who can do this as well. So you can have this piece of clay, and as it's being formed, discuss it and say, okay, well, I think you should put your hands this way or this way, and see how it changes then. So the improvable object really is an area where the students are using, or something that they're using to interact with and talk with it, but at the same time respond to. So here in this next slide, we've got a number of different iterations of this improvable object. The slide there we go. So there's like 35 of these, but I'm only going to show you 5 here today, and I'm going to show you iterations between them. But this is again, I'm only looking at the process. I'm not looking at the final product, and I'm looking at each iteration as they go through. So this improvable object is the poster, but at the same time, there's iterations, and I respond to those iterations, and the students are being talked to by those iterations. So basically, a student will make something or add something or create something or edit something. He'll upload it or she'll upload it to the online forum. Then another student, and then she'll say, well, I modified something or I changed something using the language for. And then another student will come down and download it and look at it. And when they look at it, they need to respond to it. And so in other words, this becomes like the piece of clay now, because someone's uploaded it, made some changes, someone's downloaded it, looked at it and said, okay, how do I respond to this now? What is this current understanding that this poster is telling me? And how do I respond to it in a way that sticks with this kind of centripetal force that the teacher's given me and that I've started to discuss with the students through this poster. So this poster is this area where the students are talking to each other. And for the longest time, I mean, it was difficult to understand how the learners are actually using the poster to talk to each other, because they are, and I'll show this today. So how do they do this? Well, I want to specifically look at these two posters. And on the left-hand side, we see an area that's blank on the right-hand side of the poster, okay? On the right-hand side, we see the same kind of poster. It's changed a little bit, but it's got things that have been changed on the right lower hand side of the poster down here. So what happens here? Okay, so, all right. Here is one of the students steps in and says, we need to put something here. And so S3 comes along and he says, I know what to put. And he writes this in the forum. He says in the forum, we need to have my bottles to reduce emission of CO2. Now there's some spelling mistakes and the language isn't perfect, but I mean, his point's there. We need to have my bottles to reduce emission of CO2. Okay. So he's explaining something here. He's drawing some sort of logical conclusion based on what he's seeing here. And he's saying, okay, I think we need to have my bottles to reduce emission of CO2. This is expressing a cause effect. Having my bottle cause will reduce the CO2 effect. But where does he get this from? And this is where now the idea of making the learning visible is coming into play, because I'm seeing all these different posters pop up in linear format saying, okay, I've changed this, I've done this, I've modified this, I've added this. And now if I'm going in and looking at these iterations of this poster, I can see how the learners are actually talking to each other. And I can see what they're actually saying in terms of their understanding of these issues. Okay, so let's go into this idea of this cognitive discourse functions. Now, Dalton Puffer, she's done a lot of work in this, brilliant work, okay? And she's saying that these CDFs, cognitive discourse functions, are identifiable functions of language through which the learners they externalize their cognitive processes. It's involving these subject-specific facts, concepts, and categories, okay? And we can't see learning directly. We can't observe this directly, but the CDFs now can be conceptualized as an interface between the content and language, between thinking and language. And then as Dalton Puffer stated, that although the cognition is not visible, CDFs are visible and can be observed in classroom discourse. Hello? Okay. All right, so her work proposed a way to conceptualize the integration of content and language by linking up the subject-specific cognitive learning goals with the linguistic representation. So we're going to use these, as it said in my abstract, we're going to use this now to identify what the learners are actually doing with the language and content integration to actually talk to each other. Because as teachers, if I'm looking at a content, for example, I might think, okay, well, the content's correct, but the language is not correct, or the language is really nice, but the content's not really there. But the students, I don't think they look at it this way. They're looking at the content and language as an integration and saying, how do I understand this? And how do I respond to this? Okay. So let's go back here now. And I know this slide's not pretty, but it's very functional. And it tells us exactly what this S4 here is doing, because this is S4. And what she's done here is she's shown us, she's influencing the environment. PET bottles make CO2. She's reporting this information, but then down below, she's saying, here's an example. And she's comparing here. And she uses actually the 500 times in a different color font to make the comparison between CO2 and PET bottles and the same tap water, same amount of tap water. So she's comparing here. Now, in number 2, she's specifying, okay, there's a problem here, okay? But she's also contrasting. She's saying, well, here's the cost of manufacturing, and here's the cost of recycling. And it's 3 times more expensive. Okay, so what does this mean now? What is she actually saying here? Well, she's expressing a cause and effect. Now, you might say, well, how do you see this cause and effect? Well, PET bottles, recycling PET bottle costs much money and energy. So what she's saying here is that recycling isn't done because the costs for recycling are too excessive. Okay, so she summarizes this as a final statement, but this whole thing itself is also a cause and effect, because she's saying, you know, if we're having so many, if recycling is costing so much money to do, and manufacturing is so much cheaper, then yes, we're going to manufacture more, we're going to develop more CO, release more CO2, and we're going to have an influence on the environment. So this is what she's doing here in this area. She's expressing a cause effect in terms of the manufacturing cost versus recycling costs, how much CO2 is released, much more than regular tap water, and therefore overall, we've got this influence on the environment. On the other hand, on the right-hand side of the graph, we see this presenting. This is the university students' pet bottle situation. They did a survey to all the students on campus, and they've got this results. They've labeled the graphs, but now they're comparing and contrasting the data in terms of, okay, on the left-hand side, here's how many pet bottles the students are using in a week, and a number of pet bottles, a number of people. And on the right-hand side, do you have your actual my own bottle kind of thing? And then you can say, okay, do they actually use my bottle, or do we have my bottle or no? So they're comparing and they're summarizing the data. They've gone from numbers to graphs. Now, to give you an example of what I might do in the classroom here is, and this is a real case example where one of the students was sitting there at her computer, and she's got the numbers in front of her, and she says, I want to make a graph. And, I don't want to teach her. So what I do is I say to her, okay, stand up. And I say, okay, class, she's got a question, and puts her on the spot really. But she says, I want to use Excel to make a graph. And then halfway across the room, some guy looks at this, I'm going to take advantage of this situation. I want to meet her. And next thing you know, 10 minutes later, I come around again, and she's got a graph on her screen, and they've co-constructed this graph, and this is where the graph comes from. So in other words, my job in the classroom is changing now. I'm not looking at it and saying, I'm going to teach you how to use Excel. I'm going to say, well, does anybody in the classroom know how to do this, and can you help each other? So now my job is becoming more of a facilitator, but at the same time, and this goes with the grammar and the language as well, because I can say to them, this sentence maybe is not, I can understand what you're trying to say, but it's not clear grammatically. Can someone help, please? And next thing you know, 4 or 5 people are standing around this computer trying to figure out what this sentence should say. Okay. So we go back to the original graph now, with this original poster, and we can see exactly where S3 gets this, we need to have my bottles to reduce emission of CO2 comes from. It comes directly from the identifying the number of people who don't have my bottle, 77 people. And we also see that there's an excessive amount of CO2 being released because recycling is too expensive. So again, recycling is still core in this. So he's expressing a cause effect again, right? This solution draws from the S4's content about CO2 emissions and S1's my bottle pie graph. So he's made this pie graph, she's made her influence, and therefore we can see how he is interacting with this graph to be able to come up with this kind of solution, okay? Now, I didn't teach them this. I didn't tell them what kind of solutions to develop. I didn't tell them to make an anti-pet bottle campaign or to make a my bottle campaign, but this is what they came up with through their interaction with each other, through this development of intersubjectivity around this concept of recycling, but then developing an understanding and realizing that this problem is much more bigger than they anticipated. Okay. So now this is where, S1 says we need something down below, and S3 responds and says, yes, here's my idea. Well, S1 says, well, this is a fantastic idea. Thank you. And he says, I'm going to put that in for you. So he puts it in, but he changes it. So now, where does he get his change from? This is kind of cheeky. He said, S3's got this great idea. He says it's a great idea, but then he responds by putting it here. It's important that we don't use PET bottles as much as possible. You should use a canteen or my bottle. So where does his understanding come from? Well, it turns out that his understanding comes from specifically those two graphs. Why? Well, because he was instrumental in making these graphs for one, so he's understanding these graphs. I can see that. And he's arguing now. It's important we don't use PET bottles. You should use a canteen or my bottle. So this is an argument, okay? So what happens next is really, really interesting, because now it tells me what's being done in addition to this final kind of anti-campaign kind of slogan that they've come up with. Number one is 4 comes along now, and she says, I want to talk about what the graphs say. So I'm going to go from numbers to now the graphs to now describing the graphs. And these graphs show that. And the first sentence is about the left graph, and the second sentence is about the right-hand side graph. But then she's describing these graphs, but at the same time, below that, she has an arrow, and it says bad effect on environment. Well, then where does this come from? Well, it turns out that it comes from the area where she says, or she talks about the influence of the environment. So she's expressing, again, this cause-effect kind of idea. So she's saying, look at, here's what the graphs show. Here's what we know about recycling and manufacturing costs. And therefore, because of this data, we're having a bad effect on the environment. So at the end, S2 comes along and makes their own change now. So this is, again, the students are now going through this and thinking, well, I agree with S3. We need to have my bottles to reduce the emission of CO2. That was a cause-effect kind of statement. S1 comes along now and says, well, I'm going to change it. And now it's an argumentative statement. So you should use. And now S2 comes along now, and she's saying, okay, hold on again. We shouldn't use PET bottles as much as possible. She's kind of using his language from S1, and she's now reasoning. She's saying, okay, let's look at the data. We shouldn't use PET bottles as much as possible. And now she's offering a solution. She's recommending. And she's made a deduction that, okay, if we're going to solve this problem, let's use my PET bottle. In other words, it's no longer an argument. It's more of a solution with some sort of slogan that, a suggestion, for example. We've gone from all these different things down. And this S2 statement here isn't S2 alone statement. This is co-constructed through S3, through S1, through S2, plus S4, who's done the work on CO2 and the describing of the graph. So we can see how all of these 3 statements here come from their interaction with each other in this graph, in this poster. So they're using the poster as a way to discuss with each other. But through this process now, as we go back, the teacher is looking at this and saying, okay, well, what is this telling me? Well, we can see they're arguing. They're talking about this cause and effect. They're expressing this cause and effect. They're summarizing, they're reporting. Okay, they're presenting, they're arguing, they're reasoning, they're suggesting. So they're doing all these different things with the language in this poster to talk with each other. So if we look at this from the idea of assessment for learning now, okay, here we go. Okay, so the teacher can use this. What can the teacher do with this? How can the teacher use this? Because again, I'm not really interested in the final product. I'm really interested in what's happening in between. So I can walk around the classroom. I can go into the forums, for example, and I can see what the students are doing and use that for unplanned assessment opportunities. So in other words, I can go to somebody and say, okay, you talked about this in the forum. What do you mean by that? Or you talked about this concept in the forum. Can you explain that to me more? Or how do you think you could develop it further? At the same time, we can also look at the different modalities that the students have learned or started to use, because again, the modalities comes from them. And also what, as you can see in this kind of interaction later on in the posters as well, which I haven't shown, is that the students bring in biology, they bring in environmental issues, they bring in geography, they bring in chemistry. They talk about PET balls from the chemical level. They bring in the idea of BPH, the hazards. So they bring in all of these different subjects now because of this choice, creativity, and contingency, and because of this centrifugal interaction, they're bringing in what they need in order to help themselves understand what this issue is all about and develop their ideas and develop their thinking better using this idea of this improvable object as we go along. Okay, so it's not just the language and content that they're using, but it's also the modalities. You can say to the student, you use this graph, how would you describe the graph, for example, if I hadn't seen the description of the graph? Or you've got these numbers now, what do these numbers mean? How can you best represent them? And you can see how the student had done that. They had gone and made a bar graph in one, and they had made a pie graph in the other. Why they used those two? I mean, obviously, they had some sort of understanding in terms of what they wanted to show. And that was from their understanding of how Excel worked and how the data, what the data was showing them. Okay, so, and then also the layout shows us a huge amount of information in terms of, the arrows that they have, the text boxes that they have, the way that they've spaced everything, the spatiality, and how they've made different analogies. So we've got all these different things that are happening because of this centrifugal interaction that's allowed to occur. But at the same time, this piece of concept that I made them stick to, because even in the end, recycling was still a huge part of their poster, but they had gone much more beyond that, and developed their thinking about this as a much bigger issue than they had anticipated. So their idea of PET bottles to begin with, and their idea of PET bottle at the end was also a new understanding of what a PET bottle is and what it looks like. Okay, so we look at kind of takeaway messages here. This centripetal tension that we need is a point for the learners to work from. So in my case, I mean, this was an 8-week thing. So the students had 8 weeks to develop this project. And so they've gone from asking students how many PET bottles they use on campus to learning about what happens in Japan, what happens in the world, how many PET bottles are actually used, where they end up in the ocean. They went all these different things. But again, it's stemmed around this parameters that I had given them. You need to make a poster. It needs to be in English. And here's the concept that you need to work from. The central interaction that emerged in this is based on this competent-based approach. Very rich interaction that we see in the forums and in the posters, okay? And also we see a huge integration of, well, not just the everyday language, but they also bringing in the academic language as well. So they talk about things like annual consumption. And at the same time, they talk about, every year, this how many bottles are used. So they can use both of those in the same sentences. And to them, it's this idea of using the language that they have available to them, plus using the new language. The use of CDFs now makes this learning visible. So I can look at something that the students have done, knowing that this tension is there between what I gave them versus where they're going, and seeing what they're actually doing with that, and how I can go in there and see what kind of understanding that they have in terms of these concepts. And then at the end, I can say, well, based on what I'm seeing now as a visible kind of, is I can actually go in now and say, okay, here are some learning opportunities that I can assess. I can assess for learning opportunities, but also I can also take some interaction that may be happening in the classroom and make myself into the role of a facilitator and say, okay, you need to work on this. Can someone else help her, please? So I'm kind of making myself invisible here in terms of as a teacher, and kind of making myself less useful, but at the same time, really letting the students do what they need to do. So this is basically what I wanted to show you today. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. So now 2:40, we have 10 minutes of question and answer time. Okay, anyone who wants to ask Mark? Anyone? I'd like to ask one question. Is assessment is a very important topic these days. I think many researchers or teachers are interested in CLIL assessment. What is the most popular topics of assessment, CLIL assessment?
What is the most popular topics assessment?
While you were working at the CLIL assessment.
Well, I mean, what my focus is really is the development of the learners, right? So I don't really look at assessment in terms of the content or language, but I look at the assessment of the process and being able to understand what the learners are doing at that particular moment in time and say, okay, well, let's look at the content or let's look at the language and say, okay, how do I respond to what the learners are doing at that particular time? Now, I mean, there's that, and we've discussed it at great length. There's that whole issue of, do I assess the content versus do I assess the language? But I'm actually looking at this from the point of view of, I mean, you're assessing their conceptual understanding and their ability to say what they need to say at that, and what is their understanding of that? And you can look for these opportunities to say, well, if you're going to make some sort of comparison now, what is the best language that you can use to make that a comparison? I mean, your comparison is clear, but the grammar is not there. Or you've got a really good sentence here. what exactly you're trying to do, and kind of work with the student rather than saying to them, okay, I'm going to focus on assessing your content versus I'm going to assess the language, but actually looking at both of them at the same time and understanding what they're trying to say. So this is where I'm coming from.
Yeah, thank you very much. And